The storm raged outside, its fury shaking the very foundation of John's home. The wind howled like a lost soul, and the rain pounded against the windows, blurring the world beyond. But amidst the chaos, John heard something, a faint, desperate whimper cutting through the noise. It didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the storm. As he walked through the mud, the beam of the flashlight sliced through the darkness. That's when he saw it. A trembling creature, lying under a fallen branch, soaked to the bone and covered in blood. It looked like a dog, but there was something about its eyes, something deep, something ancient. John's heart skipped a beat. What was it? Make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's dive back into the story. John's home, which usually felt like a safe haven, now felt like a small island adrift in a stormy sea. The fire crackled and popped, casting shadows that danced on the walls, while the world outside was drowned in the deafening roar of the rain. It was into this eerie, violent night that John stepped, following the whimper that would lead him to the creature he would come to know as Shadow. As time passed, Shadow's presence in John's home became an established part of his life. The strange, stormy night when John had found the injured animal in the woods now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the peaceful days that followed. But even in those days of calm, there was always something about Shadow that kept John on edge. It wasn't the creature's presence in itself. No, it was the way he existed in that presence, the way he moved, the way he looked, and how he seemed to observe the world around him in ways that a dog simply didn't. At first, it was easy to brush off the little things. The occasional eerie silence in the house when Shadow was around, the way he would glide from room to room like a shadow, always with the grace of an unseen force. His movements were almost ghost-like, so much so that John often felt as though Shadow could disappear at any moment, blending seamlessly into the air itself. His golden eyes were always sharp, always watching, observing, and understanding things that were beyond John's comprehension. John had always thought of dogs as loyal companions, eager to please, quick to follow their owners, and excited for every small gesture of attention. But Shadow wasn't like that. He didn't jump up to greet John when he came home from town. He didn't wag his tail or bark at the sight of food. Instead, he would watch John with a calm yet intense gaze, his head tilted slightly as if trying to decode every move, every word, and every action. It was unnerving to feel like you were being studied by a creature that was supposed to be a pet. But John pushed those feelings aside, reasoning that Shadow might just be a quiet breed of dog, one that wasn't easily excitable or playful. However, as days turned into weeks, John began to notice more behaviors that seemed to set Shadow apart from any dog he had ever known. Shadow's silence was no longer just a matter of temperament. It was as if he had mastered the art of being unnoticed, slipping through rooms, never causing a sound. John would find him in places he hadn't been moments before, perched by the window, staring out into the night with a look of deep focus. It was as if Shadow wasn't simply observing the world outside. He was listening to something that wasn't there for John to hear. He would sit for hours, motionless, his golden eyes scanning the trees in the distance, his ears pricked up like he was waiting for something or someone. It was a subtle thing at first, the change in Shadow's behavior, but soon it became undeniable. He would sometimes sit still, looking into the shadows of the room, as though he was seeing something John couldn't. His eyes would flicker, as if reacting to movements that weren't there, and his body would tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation. But when John looked around, there was nothing there, nothing but the silent, still room and the soft crackling of the fireplace. It was as if Shadow could sense things, hear things, that John couldn't, and that unnerved him. It was hard to shake the feeling that there was more to this creature than what he had initially thought. At night, when the rest of the house slept, John could sometimes hear Shadow moving around the house. But it wasn't the sound of paws on wood. It was almost like the quietest of whispers, a movement so fluid and silent that it seemed unnatural. John would wake to find Shadow sitting by the window again, his eyes reflecting the faint light of the moon, as if he were waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. These moments were the ones that made John uneasy. What could Shadow be waiting for? Why didn't he ever bark or make noise? Why was he always so still, so observant, even when the world outside was silent? As John continued to watch, the truth started to settle in his gut, though he wouldn't let himself fully acknowledge it. The quiet behavior was starting to feel unnatural, not just shy or timid. It was as if Shadow didn't belong here at all, as if he was a creature of another world entirely. His behavior wasn't that of a dog. It was that of something else, something older, something more wild. And as the days wore on, the growing sense of discomfort gnawed at John's thoughts. The tension began to rise as the locals took notice of the strange behavior of the animal that John had brought into his home. It was inevitable. Elmsbrook was a small town, and rumors spread quickly. The residents had grown accustomed to the sight of John walking with Shadow by his side. But there was something about the animal that made them uneasy. It wasn't just the way he moved or the strange silence that surrounded him. It was something deeper, something they couldn't quite put into words, but they felt it nonetheless. One morning, as John walked into the local store, an elderly woman stopped him at the door. She had known him for years, having watched him grow up in Elmsbrook, and they exchanged pleasantries as usual. But today, her eyes lingered on Shadow, who was patiently waiting by the door, his eyes following every movement in the store. The woman leaned in close to John, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's no dog, you know." John was caught off guard. He chuckled nervously, thinking she was just spouting nonsense, but the old woman's eyes were serious, dark with something that made him pause. "There's something wild in him, John. I don't know what it is, but I can feel it." John tried to brush it off, chalking it up to superstitions. But as he left the store, he couldn't help but notice the other people in town, their curious eyes flicking toward him in shadow. The whispers, the sidelong glances, they were all starting to pile up. It wasn't just one person or even a few. The entire town seemed to be watching, sensing something about Shadow that John was too close to see. That afternoon, as John walked to the village with Shadow at his side, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The other dogs in the village, normally so eager and friendly, shrank back at the sight of Shadow. They lowered their tails, their eyes wide with fear, and some even turned to run. It was a strange, unsettling sight. Why would they be afraid of a dog? John had seen dogs of all sizes and breeds interact peacefully before. Yet here, with Shadow, it was different. Even the bravest, most confident dogs were uneasy in his presence. It wasn't just the dogs that reacted like this. John had seen it with wild animals, too. One evening, as he and Shadow were walking near the edge of the forest, a wild deer appeared from the trees, its large eyes wide with alertness. But instead of bolting at the sight of John, the deer froze. It stood stock still, staring directly at Shadow with a mix of fear and recognition in its gaze. The tension in the air was palpable, and for a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Shadow stood there, perfectly still, watching the deer with an unblinking gaze. Neither of them moved for what felt like an eternity. And then, as if released from some invisible spell, the deer turned and bounded back into the woods. John was left standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was happening with Shadow that he couldn't explain. The animal was different, and the more he tried to ignore it, the more these strange incidents piled up. He couldn't deny it any longer. There was something wild about Shadow, something that didn't belong in the confines of a human home. But what was it, and why couldn't he bring himself to question it? As much as John tried to rationalize it, a deep, nagging feeling began to take hold of him. Shadow wasn't just a dog, and John wasn't sure what he was anymore. And the more he thought about it, the more the truth seemed to be creeping closer, ready to reveal itself in a way that would change everything. The tension that had been building for so long now felt like it was about to break, and John had no idea what would come of it. The conflict was clear now. John was living with a creature that wasn't what it seemed, and he couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger that surrounded it. Whether he was ready to face it or not, the truth about Shadow was coming, and when it did, John's world would never be the same again. As the days grew colder and the leaves on the trees began to turn gold, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was living with a mystery that was slowly tightening its grip on him. The peculiarities of Shadow's behavior had grown undeniable, but still, John clung to belief that Shadow was just an unusually quiet, possibly misunderstood dog. Despite the growing oddities, John had grown so attached to Shadow that he dismissed any nagging doubts. Shadow was his companion, his friend. They had been through too much together for John to even consider the possibility that something more was at play. But the rumors around town continued to grow, adding to the weight in John's chest. He began to hear whispers from the other villagers, their voices tinged with a mix of curiosity and concern. They spoke of the strange way Shadow moved, of how he never seemed quite like the other dogs. John couldn't ignore their concerns, but he still refused to believe what he didn't want to believe. He wasn't ready to face the truth, whatever it might be. That was when Dr. Calder came into the picture. Dr. Calder, a wildlife researcher who had recently visited Elmsbrook to study the local animal population, had been hearing the same rumors that John had been trying to ignore. He was fascinated by the strange sightings of animals in the area, particularly the rumors about a creature that resembled a dog but behaved in ways that didn't align with any known breed. One evening, while John was at the local store, Dr. Calder approached him with an offer to meet. "I've been hearing some strange things about your dog," Dr. Calder said casually, his voice calm and measured. "I think I might be able to shed some light on what's been going on." John was hesitant at first, unsure what he might be walking into. He didn't know Dr. Calder well, but he had heard about the researcher's expertise in the wildlife around Elmsbrook. Still, the thought of someone else poking around his personal life, especially regarding Shadow, made John uneasy. He didn't want to face the possibility that the bond he'd formed with Shadow over the years could be based on a lie. But something in Dr. Calder's eyes, something in the way he spoke, made John decide to take a chance. The following evening, Dr. Calder arrived at John's house. Shadow, as usual, was sitting by the window, watching the outside world with his calm, intense gaze. John led the researcher inside, trying to act normal, but the tension in the air was palpable. Shadow's golden eyes followed Dr. Calder as he entered, and John couldn't help but notice how Shadow's entire body stiffened, his posture alert, as if he were sizing the researcher up. Dr. Calder crouched down, observing Shadow carefully. He didn't seem afraid or startled by the animal's presence, but rather, he studied him with a clinical interest. As John watched, his heart pounded in his chest. Shadow, who had always seemed so attuned to John, now seemed distant, almost otherworldly, as if he were a creature beyond John's understanding. After a few moments, Dr. Calder stood up slowly. He was silent for a beat, his brow furrowed. Then he spoke in a quiet, almost hushed tone. "This isn't a dog, John. I don't know what you've been told, but this creature is not a domestic pet." John's world froze. "What do you mean?" His voice was shaky, the disbelief hanging thick in the air. Dr. Calder took a deep breath, his expression serious but calm. "What you have here is either a wolf or a wolf-dog hybrid, but from the way he moves, the way he looks, I'd say it's closer to a wolf." He paused, studying John's face for any signs of understanding. Wolves are rare in these parts, but sometimes, when they're injured or lost, they can bond with humans. It's rare, but it does happen. Still, make no mistake, this creature is wild. His instincts are not those of a domestic animal. John stood there, frozen in shock. The words rang in his ears, but they made no sense. How could this be true? Shadow, his loyal companion for years, could be something entirely different? A wolf? His mind raced with a flood of thoughts. The strange way Shadow had always been, his unsettling intelligence, the way other animals seemed to respond to him. Everything began to fall into place in a way that was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. "No," John whispered, his voice trembling. "That can't be right. Shadow, he's not like that. He's just different, maybe, but he's a dog. He's my dog." Dr. Calder's gaze softened, his voice still calm. "I know this is hard to hear, John, but the truth doesn't change just because we don't want to face it. This animal is a wild creature, and he's been living with you for years under false pretenses." John felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The weight of the revelation was more than he could bear. The animal he had cared for, the creature he had loved and protected, was not what he had believed. Shadow wasn't a pet. He wasn't just a dog. And in that moment, John realized the dangerous reality that had been hiding in plain sight all these years. As the room seemed to close in around him, John's mind raced through memories of Shadow's odd behaviors. The way he never barked, the way he never sought affection in the same way as other dogs, the way he would always retreat into the shadows of the room. John had seen the signs, but he had been so blinded by his own emotions, by his attachment to the animal, that he had never questioned them. But now, standing in front of Dr. Calder, the truth seemed undeniable. Shadow, his loyal companion, was not a dog at all. He was something wild, something dangerous. And as the weight of that realization settled in, John knew he had to make a choice. What did this mean for Shadow? What did it mean for him? Dr. Calder's calm demeanor had brought John back to reality in a way that nothing else could. His approach, both scientific and empathetic, allowed John to see the situation from a perspective he hadn't considered before. Where John had been clouded by emotion, Dr. Calder had seen the truth clearly and without bias. And it was this clarity, this calm understanding, that made him the unexpected hero in John's story. John didn't know it yet, but the decisions he would have to make in the coming days would change everything. The truth about Shadow had been revealed, and with it came the dawning realization that John could no longer ignore the wild, untamable nature of the animal he had come to love. The bond they had shared was about to be tested in ways that John had never imagined. But the first step in understanding the reality of their situation had been taken. With Dr. Calder's help, John had been forced to see the truth. And in that moment, everything changed. The moment Dr. Calder spoke the words John had been dreading, everything seemed to stop. "This isn't a dog, John," he had said, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "This is a wolf, or at least a wolf-dog hybrid." John's mind went blank as the weight of the revelation hit him, each word like a physical blow to his chest. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He wasn't just a loyal companion. He was a creature of the wild, a beast that didn't belong in the confines of a home. John stood there, paralyzed, unable to process the truth that was unfolding before him. The walls of the house, the warmth of the fire crackling on the hearth, the small, familiar world he had built with Shadow, all of it suddenly felt distant, foreign, as if he were seeing it through a fog. For a moment, everything faded into a blur of confusion. Shadow, who had been his constant companion, his friend, his protector, was not what John had believed him to be, and the truth was staring John in the face with the harshness of reality. Dr. Calder's words hung in the air, thick with gravity. "I know this is hard," he continued, his tone gentle yet firm. "But you've been living with a wild animal, John. A wolf's instincts are not like those of a domestic dog. It's in their nature to be free, to roam, to live in the wild. And Shadow, he's been holding on to something that's not meant to be contained." John's heart pounded in his chest. He had always known there was something different about Shadow, something that set him apart from every other dog he had ever known. But he had never allowed himself to acknowledge it. Shadow's silent intelligence, the way he moved with a predator's grace, his unshakable presence, all of it had been clues. But John had ignored them, holding on to the belief that he had saved a poor, injured dog and that their bond was real. But now, with Dr. Calder's revelation, John's world was crumbling. His love for Shadow, his deep attachment to the animal that had been by his side through countless moments of quiet companionship, was now tinged with uncertainty. The bond they shared, so real, so comforting, so true, suddenly felt tainted by the weight of Shadow's true nature. John had spent years with Shadow, caring for him, feeding him, protecting him from the storms of life. He had treated him like family. But now he was faced with a painful reality. Shadow was not a dog. He was wild. His instincts, his nature, were not those of a domestic animal. And no matter how much John loved him, that truth couldn't be ignored. Shadow was not meant to be confined, not meant to live in a world so far removed from the wilderness from which he came. Dr. Calder's voice broke through John's thoughts. "John, I know this is difficult, but you have to understand something. Wolves are not pets. And Shadow's instincts, his wild nature, they're stronger than the bond you formed with him. He belongs in the wild, John. It's not safe for either of you to keep him here any longer." The words hit John like a freight train. The pain of the realization was almost physical, a sharp ache in his chest. For years, he had considered Shadow to be his companion, his protector, his friend. He had never imagined a day would come when he would have to face the truth that Shadow was a creature of the wild. But as much as it hurt, John knew that Dr. Calder was right. Deep down, he had always sensed that Shadow was different, that the creature he had cared for was something more than just a pet. Shadow's wild instincts had always been there, simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break through. And that moment had arrived. John couldn't deny it any longer. Shadow's place was not in a small house on the edge of a quiet town. His place was in the wild, where he could roam freely, where he could be the creature he was born to be. The emotional weight of the moment pressed down on John, heavy and suffocating. He had loved Shadow, loved him like a part of himself. But now, that love had to be tempered with the harsh truth. Love sometimes meant letting go. Sometimes, loving someone meant setting them free. John turned to look at Shadow, who was sitting in the corner of the room, watching him with those golden eyes that had always seemed so knowing. For a moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Shadow's gaze held John's, unblinking, unwavering. In that moment, John knew that Shadow understood. The wildness in those eyes, the ancient intelligence that John had once seen as something beautiful and unique, now felt like a reminder that Shadow was not his to keep. He belonged to the wilderness, to the untamed world outside. The realization hit John like a tidal wave. He couldn't keep Shadow in the house any longer. The animal had always been a part of the wild, a creature who'd been bound to him by circumstances, not by nature. And now, John had to make the hardest decision of his life, to let Shadow go, to set him free. As the weight of that decision sank in, John felt a deep sadness wash over him. The love he had for Shadow was so powerful, so pure, that the thought of letting him go felt like a betrayal. But he knew it wasn't. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. Shadow needed to be free. Dr. Calder watched John, his face a mixture of sympathy and understanding. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly. "This is the hardest part, but it's the only way for him to truly live." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He stood there for a long moment, looking at Shadow, who had not moved an inch, still watching him with those quiet, knowing eyes. And in that moment, John made the decision. It was time to say goodbye. It was time to set Shadow free. The finality of it hit John harder than anything else had. He had spent so many years with Shadow, and now he had to let go. But deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. Shadow had never truly been his. He had been a creature of the wild, and it was time for him to return to that life, where he could be free. As John turned toward the door, ready to take the first steps toward the hardest goodbye of his life, Shadow stood up, his massive frame moving silently across the room. For a moment, John thought Shadow might hesitate, that he might show some sign of reluctance. But instead, the wolf-dog hybrid walked toward him, his golden eyes soft, understanding. And for the first time, John saw something that took his breath away. Shadow was not afraid. He wasn't angry or upset. He simply knew. With a lump in his throat, John whispered, "It's time for you to go, boy. You're free now." The bond between them, deep and unspoken, held strong in that moment. And though it was the hardest thing John had ever done, he knew he had made the right decision. Shadow's freedom was the only gift he could give him, the gift of returning to the wild, to the life he was born for. And as Shadow walked out into the night, disappearing into the trees, John felt a bittersweet peace. He had let go, but in that letting go, he had given Shadow the one thing that mattered most, his freedom. The silence that followed Shadow's departure was deafening. The door closed softly behind him, and for a moment, John stood frozen, staring at the empty space where a companion had just been. The wind howled outside, but inside the house, there was only an eerie quiet, a stillness that felt unnatural, unsettling. It was as if the world itself had paused and allowed John a moment to breathe. But even that brief respite felt like an eternity. His body was numb, his heart heavy, as if a piece of him had just been ripped away. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, the faintest remnants of Shadow's presence still lingering in the air. The house, which had once been filled with the quiet sound of Shadow's movements, now felt hollow, a cavern of memories that he could no longer escape. He could still feel the weight of the animal's gaze on him. The quiet presence that had been by his side through so many lonely nights, through moments of joy and sorrow, and through the storm that had brought them together. But now, all that remained was a quiet space Shadow had left behind, a void that felt both too vast and too suffocating to fill. John's thoughts were a swirling mass of confusion and grief. How could this have happened? How had he not seen it? All the signs had been there, right from the beginning. The way Shadow never quite fit the mold of a dog, the way he moved with such silent grace, the way his eyes had always seemed to carry a depth of knowledge and understanding that went beyond anything a pet could offer. John had ignored the signs, brushed them aside, telling himself that Shadow was just different, that it somehow found a unique bond with an animal that no one else could understand. But now, the painful truth was staring him in the face. Shadow wasn't just a pet. He was a creature of the wild, a being who had never belonged in the confines of a human life. The realization hit John like a physical blow. The years they had spent together, the moments of quiet companionship, the unconditional loyalty that Shadow had given him, all of it now felt like a lie, like something that had been built on a false foundation. Shadow had never been meant to stay with him. He had been a part of a world far beyond anything John could understand, a world where freedom and wild instincts reigned. And in trying to bring Shadow into his world, John had unknowingly trapped him, forcing him into a life that was never meant to be. John's chest tightened as the full weight of the decision settled on him. Letting go of Shadow had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but it was the right thing to do. He had freed Shadow, given him back the life he had been born to live. And yet, John couldn't escape the deep ache in his heart. It wasn't just the loss of his companion. It was a loss of the bond they had shared, a bond that had been built on love and trust, but had never truly been his to keep. Shadow had been a gift, a wild, untamable spirit that had entered John's life for a time and then disappeared, leaving behind a trail of memories that John would carry with him forever. As John sat down by the fireplace, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls, his mind wandered back to the first day he had found Shadow. The storm had raged outside, the winds howling, the rain pouring down in sheets. And there, huddled beneath a fallen branch, had been the creature that would change his life forever. At that moment, John had thought he was rescuing a dog. He had thought he was saving a helpless animal from the cold and the storm. But now, with the truth laid bare before him, John realized that Shadow had never been helpless. Shadow had always been strong, always been a creature of the wild, and John had simply been the one to carry him for a time. The pain of that realization was overwhelming. John had loved Shadow, loved him with a depth and sincerity that was beyond anything he had ever felt. But in loving him, he had also kept him confined, trapped in a life that wasn't meant for him. The grief that washed over John was not just for the loss of a friend, but for the understanding that he played a role in keeping Shadow from living the life he was meant to live. The weight of that guilt was crushing. How could he have been so blind? How could he have ignored the signs? The way Shadow had always seemed different, the way he had never truly fit the mold of a dog. John closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. The sound of Shadow's footsteps on the wooden floorboards, so soft and silent that it felt like he was walking on air. The way Shadow would sit by the window at night, his eyes glowing in the dim light, watching the world outside with strange, knowing gaze. The way he had never barked, never sought affection the way a dog should. And yet, despite all the strange behavior, John had grown to love him, had come to rely on him in ways he hadn't even realized. Shadow had been more than a pet. He had been a constant, a source of comfort, a companion who never judged, who never asked for anything in return. Now, John was left alone in the quiet emptiness of the house, with only the memories of the creature who had once been by his side. He reached out, almost unconsciously, to the space where Shadow used to lie. But the spot was empty now, just as the house felt empty. And for the first time, John realized how much he had come to depend on Shadow, how much he relied on the animal's presence to fill the spaces in his life that were otherwise empty. Without Shadow, the house felt too quiet, too still, as if the air itself had become heavier. John's grief was deep, but it was also complicated. There was a sorrow in his heart for the bond that had been lost, for the years he had spent with Shadow, believing him to be something he wasn't. But there was also a sense of peace in knowing that Shadow was free now, that he was where he truly belonged. John had set him free, giving him the chance to live a life that was meant for him. And though the ache of loss would linger, John knew that the decision he had made was the right one. The emotional weight of the moment pressed heavily on John's chest as he sat in the silence of the house, the fire slowly fading to embers. The loneliness was overwhelming, but it was also a reminder of the love he had shared with Shadow, a love that had been pure, unspoken, and unwavering. Even though Shadow was gone, John would carry that love with him forever. The bond they had shared was not something that could be erased. It was a part of John now, a part of his heart that would never truly heal, but that he would cherish for the rest of his life. And so, as the night wore on and the fire burned low, John sat in the quiet, the weight of his grief heavy in the air. But even in the pain, he found a strange comfort. Shadow was free, and in letting him go, John had learned the true meaning of love. Sometimes, the greatest act of love is to let go. The story of John and Shadow is about the profound lesson that love sometimes means letting go. John learns that true love isn't about possession. It's about understanding the needs of those we love. Even if it means setting them free, the deeper message emphasizes that creatures of the wild are not meant to be tamed. Freedom is an essential part of their nature, and John's realization forces him to confront the truth. Shadow, as much as he loved him, belonged in the wild, not in the confines of human home. John's heartache as he watches Shadow disappear into the trees is the final emotional beat of the story. His words, "You're free now," capture the weight of his decision to let go of his beloved companion. If you've ever loved something so deeply, you know the pain of letting go. But sometimes, love means allowing someone to live the life they were meant to live. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming journeys.